Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Code Talk, one of our monthly series hosted by CODE-CWA, where workers and organizers in the tech industry study and try to explore historical, economic, and political contexts in which we struggle. Tonight, we're hosting a question and answer session with Wendy Liu, the author of Abolish Silicon Valley, and we'll be talking about how to liberate technology from capitalism. This will be a two-part Q&A, and the first will be moderated between myself, Emma, and Wendy. The second part will be open to the audience Q&As. For those who RSVP'd for the event, please check your emails for a link to join the call through which you can submit questions if you want. And feel free to send in multiple questions at any point in the event. All right, let's go. So my name's Wes. I'm a campaign lead with CODE-CWA, working with tech workers around the country and in solidarity around the world to build unions. Emma, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, my name is Emma Kinema. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a West Coast-based organizer similar to Wes, working in the tech, games, and digital media industries.
Great. Wendy, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, Wendy, she, her. I am a writer and software engineer, still trying to figure out what I'm doing. But yeah, this book I wrote came out about 2 months ago, right in the middle of this pandemic. So it's been an interesting time. It's a very strange way to have to promote a book. But thank you both for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who's listening for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. So I guess we're just going to jump into some questions. Some of them, I guess, are to begin with, because I really enjoyed the book. I know we spoke before. We talked a little bit about how it's an evolution in your thinking about the tech industry and sort of the political economy around it. And you mentioned that you were at McGill during 2011 when there was a ton of student activism, right? Which you didn't participate in those protests. You said in the book that you liked the idea of tuition hikes because you thought it may lead to like the end of useless degrees that don't lead to high-paying jobs or highly skilled jobs. Obviously, the higher education industrial complex has led to increased student debt and stagnant wages, as we know that. So how do you view the material conditions of engineers and tech workers broadly declining moving forward as the market of people with these baseline skills increases?
Yeah, great question. So I guess I'll start off by just contextualizing that a little bit more for those who, haven't heard about what was happening then. Back in 2011, there were all these student movements around the tuition hikes, which would have increased tuition from, a very, very low amount to an amount that, is still low by like US standards, but would represent a really large relative hike. And it was complicated because as a student then, I would not have personally have been impacted by them because the hikes would start after I graduated. But, I was paying attention to it, and everyone was kind of asked to decide if they supported it or were against it. And for myself and a lot of my friends who were in STEM, most of us were just like, the people who are complaining are just being impractical. It's just art students who want to be able to get a degree in, I don't know, whatever art history thing that they want to study, which we kind of took for granted was impractical and not useful. Whereas we, with our computer science or whatever degrees, were clearly doing something more useful. So it was essentially the analysis that I had and that was shared by a lot of my STEM friends is just a very shallow, reductive one that took at face value the fact that some people were employable and others were not, without really understanding, how do labor markets work? What is the function of education in an advanced society? What do we want higher education to be? And so it's a perspective that I now obviously regret a lot, but I think at the time, it was very prevalent to think that way. And I think there are people today in the tech industry for sure who definitely still think that way, who still, kind of take for granted the fact that because software engineers are able to make a lot of money, that means their work is intrinsically more valuable and that they deserve that money. Whereas those who don't have such great job prospects are just doing something wrong. They're just wasting their time. They're not working as hard as they should be, or otherwise their contributions are not valuable, which is ridiculous because, I think now it's very easy to see how the economic system that we have does not value things properly. If you look around the world, just like look around outside the window and see what the world is like today, it is very clear that these measures we have of, just valuing things in a financial sense don't correspond to what we as society would probably find valuable. It does not account for, the things that we actually want to cherish as a society. And I think the discussion around higher education and tuition raises and salaries, they all are symptoms of this larger problem with how capitalism values certain things, and people who aren't able to get high-paying jobs or some are seen as inferior. And for some of them, unfortunately, they internalize that and they believe that they have to change. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly, I'm also thinking about, obviously we're also talking in the context of like tons of protests and uprising around the country. And really, so much has been sparked by the murder of George Floyd over the last, couple of weeks in particular. And we're having conversations about racism like we've never had before. And the movement has incredible momentum. And I would just ask you, like, what would you say, what advice would you have for tech activists and organizers in the industry, kind of knowing your background and experience?
Oh, that's a great question. So yeah, just I guess some notes in the current moment. I think something that is very clear right now is just how much of the institutions and the systems, the norms that we have today, they're all morally bankrupt. And some people have known this for a really long time. Some are only just coming to it. Like myself, I only started noticing this in the last few years. But I think, once you kind of come to that conclusion, it's it gives you this like moral imperative to do something about it, whatever that may mean, wherever you have leverage, really. But yeah, I think the first piece of advice I would give to people is like, if you're starting to feel like the world is just awful and that all these things that you took for granted, maybe like the labor market, the police as an institution, just the way the entire economy works, if you're starting to get this like kind of dark feeling in the pit of your stomach that, oh, actually, these things are all corrupt, they're all horrible, they're all racist, they're all sexist, they're all just like inhumane, then follow that. Like, don't quash it, because even though it's very tempting to quash it, it's, just follow it, see where it goes. Figure out how to look at the world in a new way that highlights how all these systems are linked and how they're all indefensible. And then, see where that leads you to, because I think that's kind of the path that I took. And in some ways, it was a very difficult path and not necessarily a fun path. Once you start seeing the world as this awful, broken thing, then it's a little bit disheartening at times to get out of bed. But at the same time, I mean, I feel like I have a better understanding of how things really are. And, instead of just like comforting myself with these like false lies about how, oh, everything's getting better, the world will be fine. No, I don't believe that anymore. I don't think things are naturally fine. I think, all of the systems that we take for granted around us are, hopelessly imperfect. And to make things better, we all kind of have to play our part in trying to challenge the power structures as they are now. And so I guess to people who are in the tech industry and want to do something about it, I guess I would say, yeah, organize within your workplace as much as you can, even if it's over something that feels small. Like, talk to your colleagues, see how they feel about your company's Black Lives Matter statement, because I feel like a lot of tech companies have put out statements that don't really mean anything. It's just like these blanket things like, we care about Black lives, we care about racism, but at the same time, they're taking money from like police departments or from ICE or whatever. And it's like, do you really care? Or is this just trying to, make yourself sound like you care? And I think employees at these companies are well positioned to start this conversation in a way where it's like, just kind of like a way of reflecting on what that statement says and everything the statement leaves out, and maybe even asking their boss, or like talking to their coworkers and saying like, what if we put out this statement instead? Would management allow that? And that's kind of a way of almost like testing the waters and figuring out the contradictions. Like, for example, if you work at, I don't know, Nextdoor, you've probably seen your company put out a statement against racism. But at the same time, would your company also be willing to put out a statement about defunding the police, or just telling people to not call the police in certain situations, or something about publicizing the fact that some places have done eviction moratoriums. And so if people wanted to not pay their rent, they wouldn't be able to be evicted for it in certain cases. Like, what what are the limits of a political statement at a time like this? What is your company willing to say and commit to, and what are they not willing to commit to? And I think we're at this moment where there's a lot of potential for more radical conversations around race and profiteering and, where these companies stand politically. And so this is like a great opportunity, just talk to your colleagues, see what they think, see how they feel about this moment and what they think their company, your company should be doing about it. And like, are there contracts that your company has that no one really paid attention to before, but that now you're looking at, you're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be taking money from this department or from this like white supremacist group or something. And yeah, that's a really important discussion to have, I think, at a time like this.
Yeah, it's been, I think, super inspiring to see all the protests and how far reaching it is. You interned at Google for a little while, right? And breaking from a career at Google to a startup CTO ended up like really impacting your path and everything. So with plenty of hindsight now, would you have made that same choice? Because I know it was sort of like a defining moment in your development in thinking.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to look back, I don't think I would have done anything differently just because I don't know, you can't change the past. And even if you could, there's no guarantee that things would turn out as well. And I'm actually very grateful to be where I am today, even though there are definitely times when I was doing my startup when I thought, why did I do this? Like, this is awful. There's so much stress, so much uncertainty. Everything feels pointless. But at the same time, I think part of the reason I was willing to do a startup in the first place was because there was something I found dissatisfying about working at Google. Just on a personal level, just like, I don't think that was the kind of environment I wanted to work in. And now that I'm, at a point where I'm much more cynical about the tech industry, I don't think I'd want to go work at Google. I don't know, unless it was part of some sort of organized campaign, unless the company got a lot better and had like an actual union or something, I don't think I'd go back there, just because right now, I feel like there's a lot of other stuff I want to do. And I no longer believe the legitimating myths of the industry. And I think without that, it's really hard to, find joy in going to work at a company that you don't believe in. So, yeah.
I really actually sympathize with that a whole lot. As a fellow tech worker prior to, being a full-time organizer, it often felt like there was this kind of struggle between me learning more and more about the kind of seedy underbelly of the industry and the negative impacts we have on the world, and me losing faith in being a part of it. And that's so frustrating because I feel like, there's a lot of liberatory potential for the technology that we built, for the games that we make, the media that we make in the industry. Like, it could be such a benefit to people. And yet, knowing that it's being put to bad use sometimes and people are being exploited in making it, it is really tricky. But I find that, at least union organizing is my way of like flipping it back on its head and like putting workers first and like human needs first and making it a more humane experience working in the industry. So speaking of humane industries, humane working conditions, at your peak, you're working 80-hour startup weeks. You talk about believing in the transformative powers of hard work. You said even after burnout with one of your co-founders that you were afraid to work less because your life would lose meaning. How do you think we should conceive of work moving forward, especially in the realm of technology? And this is something I'm very personally interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, when I look back on that, I'm pretty embarrassed. It's just so funny because at the time I could not have ever conceived of feeling that way. Like, one of the things I talk about in the narrative of my book is a conflict that me and some of my other co-founders had with another co-founder who he's called Tim in the book, and he definitely had a much healthier work-life balance. Like, he actually had family and friends and who he kept up with regularly. He had other hobbies. He, just wanted to like have a job. Whereas the rest of us, we were just like, what's wrong with this guy? Why doesn't he want to, give our startup his entire life? And it was this, conflict that we really ultimately couldn't resolve. And at the time, I was so sure of myself. I was just so sure that he was wrong and that I was right. And that, because I'd read all these books and blog posts about successful entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, for example, who, had a point of pride in working 80, 90-hour weeks. I was convinced that I was right. I was convinced that like, this is the only way to do it. And yeah, and I think it was very difficult for me to conceive of any alternatives at the time. But now, I look back on it and I think, what was I doing? What was I building? What was so important that I had to pull an all-nighter for? It was not important. And because I was in this bubble where I was so convinced that what I was doing was important, there was no way for me to see that. It was just, if anyone had come out and told me that what I was doing was unimportant, I would have been like, I hate you. Don't ever talk to me again, just because I had completely entwined my sense of self-worth and meaning and just like, my sense of identity with this startup in a way that was very, very unhealthy. And, now that I'm a little bit wiser, certainly older, I look back on that and I think, yeah, that was just a recipe for disaster. And I think the startup world is having like a broader conversation about this. And, it's like more measured now, whereas back then, I think it was still very common for people to just say that without getting much criticism, that you should be working 80-hour weeks. I think now there's like, the industry's older, it's broader. Hopefully people are working healthier hours. But I do think that, we have to link the question of working long hours to the question of exploitation. Because it's not just when you're working as a founder, it's different from if you're working as like a salaried employee for a large company. Because as a founder, even though I was working in a really ridiculous, unnecessary way, at least I had some control over the company, right? Like as a founder, I had, 20 something % shares in the company. And so at least I had control over that. But most people who are working really long hours are not founders. They're working for someone else. And maybe they feel like they have to work hard because otherwise they'll lose their job, or that their coworkers don't respect them. And I think that is like a really important thing to push back on, because, that constitutes a toxic work environment. And it's a kind of toxic work environment that's often shrouded in this myth of like, if you love your job, then you should be working hard. If you aren't pulling all-nighters, then you just clearly aren't dedicated enough, and we'll find someone more dedicated than you. And, you should be, it's like a privilege to work here. You should be giving it your all, which is just a way to cover for exploitation. Because, if workers who, work overtime actually had some control over the company, and it was kind of like a democratic decision over whether or not they would need to work harder, that would be one thing. But the way it is now is it's just, you have these companies that are maybe like owned by a couple of billionaires or something, with all these random, investors. And then the boss is like telling the workers, like, you just got to like work overtime. And Emma, I'm sure you're familiar with this in like the games industry, right? Where this is just like so widespread. And every time I read about it, I just cringe, because I completely see how some people would actually buy into that. Because on the one hand, it links to this really, what's the term? Really widespread sentiment in the tech industry among people who are, programmers, or anyone who has a job where they really enjoy their what they're doing, and they feel like they've worked hard to get these skills. There's this attitude in those fields of like, you have to work really hard to like prove your worth, and that you get to where you are because of how hard you worked. And so you have to keep doing that even once you get the job. And it's like, no, that's just cover for just really horrendous exploitation. And I think, yeah, if for overtime and like working such long hours to be okay, I think the worker who's doing it has to have a greater control over their work, over the output of their work, the conditions, how much they're getting paid, the things that they're making, and that's just not where we're at right now, unfortunately. Like, the vast majority of people working long hours, they're not a co-op. They don't get to decide what their hours are being used for. They have no say over if the boss decides like, oh, actually the thing that you guys were all working on for the last 3 months, we're going to scrap it and replace it with something else. And I think that's a really horrendous thing. For people who are, like me, working on their own startups, I don't have, I guess it's a different thing. And so the way I would feel about that is like, is it worth it? And I think that's a very hard question to ask yourself. I certainly did not want to ask myself it. But when I look back on it now, I had concluded that it was not worth it. The product we were building was pretty meaningless. And I was using the startup as a distraction from the fact that my life as a whole just felt kind of meaningless. And I just didn't know what I should be doing with myself. And so, yeah, it was a crutch. It was not actually something that brought me like a substantive, meaningful kind of joy or sense of purpose, but it was just a distraction. And because there were all these powerful people who said that working on a startup is like the best thing you should be doing with your life. I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds right. Elon Musk, Paul Graham, people like that, they're all saying this. This got to be true.
Yeah, it's really interesting how, even like you kind of bring this up in the book, right? Like even startups, founders, most of them don't really make it. Most of them make like very little money or no money. And so it's this whole like American, especially very Americanized, like illusion of, becoming a billionaire or something. But we're organizers, right? We build organizing committees. We help workers try to come together to work together on big problems, like how to rearrange the power dynamic at a company and win a union, right? So that's pretty tough. What advice would you have from your experience working sort of intimately with your co-founders and that team on like how to navigate interpersonal problems and like strategic disagreements? And also how do you deal with burnout, right? Which, a lot of tech workers face too.
Yeah, I'll share like a couple of anecdotes that kind of helped. So, yeah, with my co-founders, it was really tough because there were so many things that we would disagree on, but at the end of the day, we still had to work with each other. There was just, there's no real way around it. There was no one who would adjudicate things on our behalf. We had to kind of make the decisions on our own. And I remember one really just difficult conversation we were having. I don't even know what it was about anymore, but it was like almost like an existential point of conflict between us where we just couldn't decide. And so what we ended up doing is we kind of locked ourselves in this room, in the accelerator office where we were, just for like a day, and we had this conversation. And my idea was like, what if we started out by trying to make the vibe better by saying things that we admire about everybody else, and then we confess our own greatest weaknesses. And I think that actually helped, because after that it was much easier to come to to recognize that we were actually there because we respected each other, and that even though we might have differing opinions, we still like ultimately wanted the same thing. And the way to kind of remember that is just to say like, oh yeah, actually we, the people that we're around, like we respect each other and we want to make something happen together. And sure, we're in a conflict right now, but we can get through that. So yeah, we did that, and that actually helped. But yeah, I don't know if I have any other great like advice for people who are trying to organize. It seems like one of those. I've been listening to a lot of like podcasts about labor organizing, just because it's so interesting to hear the stories of people who've gone through these like workplace struggles, and because it's amazing how much it seems like every boss says the same thing. And I don't know if it's because they all hire the same union busting firms, or they're just like reading the same like union busting handbooks, or they have a secret club. But yeah, I think it's actually just astounding to me how they all have the exact same lines about how like, oh, I can't believe you didn't come to me first. This is the first time hearing of this. Why didn't you just come to me? We could have a conversation. And then when that doesn't work, it's like, oh, well, the union is a third party. They're going to come in and they're going to, make you go on strike. And it's like alighting the question of what the union is exactly, the fact that it's just the workers. But, if you get this union, you'll have to pay so much money in dues, and it's like the bosses never cared about how much money the workers got before, but it's like all of a sudden they really, really care about how much money they have in their paychecks. But yeah, it's that I thought was fascinating. So I don't know if I have any advice to that other than just like, yeah, if you're organizing and you're worried about how the boss will react, just like, I don't know, read up on and like listen to the stories that people have had in other campaigns, because I guarantee you your boss will say the exact same thing that bosses have been saying for centuries. And it's a little less scary once you kind of get a sense of what they're saying, because it's just they follow the same script. It's really, really astounding.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, we at CWA, we made a website called Union Busting Playbook, and it's just exactly like you're saying, like here's like the 20 things that every boss pretty much ever in the history of time has ever said about anti-union stuff. It's really quite funny, like you're saying. It's honestly, I've run campaigns where we were preparing for like a meeting with the boss, and we thought the boss was going to spew all kinds of anti-union myths and things. So we made little bingo sheets. That's a pretty traditional thing in the labor movement where, you talk about, dues costing too much money and, the third partying and some bureaucrat's going to, get in between you and your work. And, I've literally done this in campaigns where at some point during the company-wide meeting, someone just yells out bingo. And it's like the best thing in the world because it really does flip the table. And I think, union organizing can be kind of fun and light like that. And I really appreciate that. It's what's that thing, Wes, that Tim always says in CWA? The boss will like court all these like union busting firms, and they'll pay like thousands of dollars an hour for like an expensive lawyer, but we'll give that to you for free so you can just know what they're going to do because it's the same 10 things every time. So I just get a real kick out of that. I'm really excited to hear that you're kind of hearing about that kind of stuff too, because I feel like that's one of the more fun, engaging parts of union organizing, I think.
Yeah. I mean, something I've found through like, reading about contemporary labor struggles as well as historical ones is like, it's amazing how similar a lot of these are, where you find a profession that seems on the surface like has nothing to do with software engineering, and yet the way the workers talk about their job, the way their bosses talk to them about like their demands, it's the same thing. And I think that was quite eye-opening for me, just because like I only kind of discovered like labor organizing as a thing in the last few years, and I didn't realize just how much it really threads through history, and that so much of what tech workers are unhappy about with their jobs now is like, you can find a historical analog, you can find an analog in a different job, and there are like tips that you can learn from people who've done this in the past. And that I think that's really heartening, and it's really inspiring, because it's a reminder that no matter how difficult and how awful things can be, it's like, yeah, people have dealt with similar things and they've gone through. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it does mean it's like possible. And it's worth remembering that, yeah, like organizing the tech industry today probably looks like a really daunting task for most people. And I'm sure for the two of you, firsthand how daunting it can be. But yeah, I'm sure like it was also daunting for the first dock workers in San Francisco to think about trying to organize their workforce. And, they took steps and they did it. And I think, yeah, it's worth remembering everything starts somewhere. The tech industry right now is just, a really horrible place in some ways, but at the same time, like, it doesn't have to be like that. We don't have to have companies run by billionaires and, profiting from the military and ICE and police all the time. It doesn't have to be that way. And it's not going to change unless, people who don't think they have power recognize that they do have power, and that they can exercise that power through, talking to their coworkers and forming a union.
Yeah.
Yes, a little bit of propaganda for you.
Appreciate it. We're just going to cut that whole part out, slap it on the website. I think, honestly, Wes and I can just pack it up and go home.
Yeah, that was great. Well, it's funny you say that, because I was just having a conversation with some workers about how the Flint sit-down strike that's sort of revered in labor literally was a 15-year campaign that failed a bunch of times, and like they abandoned a couple times, and eventually culminated in like this great story of struggle, but it was rocky getting there.
Yeah, I think what I'm learning just through reading a lot of labor history is just how much of this stuff took so much work, right? And it's like, we only really hear the successes, but there are a lot of failures. And I think in a way that's kind of analogous to the tech industry, the way startups are covered. Anytime a startup is covered, the press makes it seem like it just came out of thin air. One day this guy sat down in his college dorm and had an idea, and then next thing you know, he's a billionaire. And I think that's quite discouraging, because it makes it seem like that if you've put in a lot of work and you haven't succeeded, then you're just never going to succeed, which definitely isn't true. I think there's a lot of hard work and often failure that goes into any success, even if it's like a different context. But I think the same kind of applies for labor organizing, and that just like a startup, or like any kind of ambitious endeavor, there's going to be a lot of failure. There's going to be a lot of setbacks. It's going to be a long, arduous struggle a lot of the time. You can't really expect overnight success, but at the same time, you have to start somewhere, and then who knows what will happen once you kind of get going. So yeah, that's a little bit of an inspiring lesson from the startup world.
Yeah, and I feel like you're talking about how I love that you tied it to like dock workers. At some point, they were unorganized. All industries at one point were unorganized, and they had to take that scary step, that first step of like really, setting out to materially change their industry. And, it is unprecedented. It is scary. But if you think beyond just our industry, think just beyond tech and things, it's not unprecedented. People have done harder organizing in more difficult conditions than the tech industry, surely, with all of our snack bars and things. So,
Exactly. Yeah. And
yeah,
just to quickly add to that, I think it's funny because the tech industry claims to prize like ambition and disruption and doing hard things. And it's like, what could be harder than trying to organize an industry? And yeah, and to the point about like other industries, I was watching the movie Harlan County, USA, about the coal miners in West Virginia, which was just shocking. It's an astounding movie. Would totally recommend it. But I think it's funny because when we think of unions, a lot of the time people think of like coal miners. And the story of how coal miners became to be unionized is often not really told, because most people are just like, oh, a union is a member is a person in like a warehouse or a factory or a coal miner, just as if the unions like dropped down from the sky. It's like, no, people fought and like died
yeah.
to have unions, and like they were repressed by like the police and a lot of other figures all the time. And it's like, yeah, unions don't come from nowhere. They're not given to us. They're like they're made by people who are willing to often risk their lives just to be able to get a chance to like live a decent life. So yeah, it's a useful reminder.
I mean, absolutely. Even just within the history of CWA, we have, we wear red on Thursdays every week in CWA as actually a memorial to someone who died on a picket line, kind of a police hit and run. And, like you're saying, the labor movement was born out of genuine, real struggle, not just going through an election process, not just filing some paperwork. No, like actual struggle. People suffered, died, were surveilled, oppressed, jailed, kicked out of their communities. My great grandpa, one of his earliest working experiences was the Pinkertons actually burning down his mill that he was working at when he was like 16 or 17 in the Pacific Northwest. Like, really, it's real struggle. It's class struggle. We don't say that word for just the fun of it. It's a real engagement with forces of power that we're trying to force into making improvements in this world. But yeah, one of the themes in your book is kind of around ethical dilemmas brought on by tech, and I feel like this is one of those kind of unprecedented, but also I think there's lessons from history around this. The ethical dilemmas brought on by the technology that we make and how we deal with those ethical dilemmas in the industry. So I would just ask you, like, what would you say is the ethical responsibility of these companies that produce technology, and what is the role that you think workers should be playing in shaping that ethical use of the product?
Yeah, great questions. I guess I'll start by saying I think these companies have so much more ethical responsibility than they're willing to admit, just because if you look at if you look at the power structures that constitute the world today, who has power? Who has the power to actually change things? It is people who have money and people who like the corporations that kind of keep things going and are able to amass so much wealth. Are they using that wealth to make things better? For the most part, no. They're kind of just like, just following the profit motive and just doing whatever will make their shareholders happy. There's a sense in which you can say, like, by the logic of capitalism, this is all fair and just. That if we only care about fiduciary responsibility and are these companies driving shareholder value, then yeah, they're upholding all of their ethical responsibilities. That's all they have to do. And it's like, okay, that makes sense from this extremely weird, convoluted framework. We don't have to accept this framework as totalizing. We don't have to live our entire lives and just based on what will make money and what will make money. Like, that's not a useful way for a human being to survive in this world. That's like awful. It's just so reductive. So I think, yeah, like just speaking as like a human being, I think, we should all feel some sort of responsibility to making the world better and combating the injustices that are like so visible today but have been around for a long time. And for tech workers in particular, I think, where do you have leverage? what sort of leverage does your company have? What possible change can be done just by like you maybe talking to your coworkers and demanding something? And that doesn't mean that it's like necessary to only think about like what you can do through your work. I think a lot of tech workers are finding that as individuals, they can also contribute, in different ways. Like if they're working on open source projects, if they're activists in various organizations, if they're donating money, talking to friends and family, whatever, just like whatever they can do, I think it's worth doing. But at the same time, the reason it's important to talk about the workplace is because we have to look at how the world is organized today. And when I talk about capitalism, I think of it as not only, but definitely a mode of production where you have to like understand the material conditions that give rise to the social structures that exist. And what that means is like, because we live under this mode of production, the way to enact change has to come from combating the power structures in this mode. And so like where where people have leverage is, in many places, but I think the most powerful one is in the point of production at their workforce. And, we were talking about dock workers before. I think dock workers are just like a really, really important example of workers who are able to leverage their power at the point of production into demanding greater changes. And an example of this is that the dock workers in the US and also in other countries are actually, have been quite organized for a while, and they've been quite militant, and they've done some pretty innovative actions. I remember in California, especially, like the ILWU has, just been really, really radical here. And some of the things they've done in the past have included not just like organizing for better wages and working conditions, but also for ethical reasons. And things like, secondary boycotts, like if the farm workers were on strike, then maybe the ILWU local chapter would just not unload the grapes that were picked by the farm workers to support their strike. And that's like something that, in a sense feels small, but at the same time, like who are the people who are the farm workers striking against? It's, employers, it's capitalists. And how do you pose a challenge to the powerful? You do that by stopping them from making money. You do that by intervening in the point of production. I think that's something that, dock workers realized, and they're using their power to intervene in a place where they actually have a lot of leverage. And they've also, dock workers, around the world have done things like refusing to unload things from South Africa during apartheid, and just basically like taking whatever action they thought was in accordance with their morals as decided by their members. I think that's really powerful. That's the kind of labor history that most of us are not like taught in schools or anything, but it's worth remembering that, politics isn't just limited to voting. It's not just limited to going to the ballot box and saying like, I want this candidate or this slightly better candidate. It's also, it's realized through the things that you do at work, through what you're offering your labor towards. And that isn't necessarily decided from above. Like you as a worker have the power to change it, not as an individual, but as a collective, like along with your fellow workers. And I guess I'll just like end by listing another example that I find really inspiring, which is the Lucas plan. So in the 1970s, Lucas Aerospace was this company, this UK-based company that did, among other things, like defense manufacturing. So they would make arms, they would make weapons, and they were also dealing with bankruptcies around this time, and they were going to close some of their plants. And so some of the workers at their plants were saying, well, if they're going to close this plant, why can't we, the workers, just take over this plant and use it to make things that are actually useful and not just weapons? And so they proposed things like eco-friendly public transit or like medical equipment, things that they thought would actually be useful to the communities. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. Even though they spent a lot of time, drafting up plans and consulting with politicians, the company was just not on board, as you can imagine. But I think it still poses a really useful and beautiful imaginary in that, things don't have to be this way. Workers should have more say over what they're building, and they should exercise their power like in accordance with the community, in accordance with, customers, just relevant stakeholders. But at the same time, I mean, there's so much potential in imagining a different way of running things where it's not just like, I don't know, some billionaire who decides what happens at their companies. Instead, it's like the workers who are actually doing this work on a day-to-day basis, they should have more of a democratic say over like essentially what's a big chunk of their lives, right? It's like, half of your working hours are spent at work or like commuting to work or something. It's like, it's really awful that you don't have control over what happens or what your labor is used for. And that if you try to if you say something about it and you're not happy about it, you might just get fired because your boss doesn't want you to talk back. They would rather fire you than, make any meaningful change. I think that's awful. And we should all think about where we have the leverage to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, first off, I feel like I could take like 10 different tangents from everything you just said, and I could talk for like 6 hours about each subject you just brought up. But I think that the notion of where does worker power come from is the thing that I'm most interested in, because something we teach in a lot in our organizer trainings is like, where does our power come from as workers? And I think a lot of people off the top of their head, they would think, oh, it's from collecting dues, it's from building political power, it's from lawyers and staff organizers and all these big awesome things. But it's not. Like you're saying, it's exactly what you were saying. It's about the point of production and the fact that we, the workers, create everything that our companies produce. We create all of the value. We create every little inch of the product, all of the coding, the art, the music, the audio, the writing, whatever the case may be, testing it, putting it on the community, working with the community, all of these things, that's the labor. And that labor creates the value of the company. And to withdraw that labor or to threaten to withdraw that labor is a huge threat. And like you said, the only thing a lot of our bosses will really respect at the end of the day is their bottom line. And if you can impact their bottom line, then you've got their ear, I think, So yeah, I would love to dive down like 10 different rabbit holes based off of what you're talking about. But Wes, do you want to hit up some audience questions?
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. One of my former bosses when I first in the labor movement is actually in the documentary Harlan County, USA. And he always, they basically ran like a rank and file person and took over the union right before they then launched on the strike. And he was like the campaign manager, and he was like 25 years old. And it was this whole thing where it was very encouraging in this moment where like a whole youth movement is just like fed up and they haven't lost yet. So like everyone's ready to fight, and I feel like we're in that same moment now. But, you talk a lot about, in your book, about walking away, right? And about not going to grad school instead of continuing in the industry in that moment. And so we have a question from one of the audience members, Ryan. He says, as someone who works at a big tech company, I feel torn between walking away due to a dirty conscience and sticking it out around to build a coalition or build a union. You guys have touched on a lot of great stuff so far, but when do you know when to walk away? And also, are there any good books on the topic?
Ooh, that's a lovely question. I guess I don't know if I have any great insight on this. The reason I walked away was not out of this, principled decision, and more just, I just couldn't keep doing what I was doing because my startup had essentially failed, and we could have put in a lot of effort to try to pivot and try to do something else. But at that point, I think I was just like running low on energy. And for me, it was either, go to grad school or just find a different job elsewhere. And I figured that if I didn't get into grad school, I would just apply for a job elsewhere. And so I was lucky and got into grad school. It wasn't like I made this decision. It was more just like, I just gotta do something else. I'll just see what I can do. So yeah, I think it worked out for me, but at the same time, I mean, grad school is expensive. It is tough. Academia is like not a great place right now. I think part of the reason that I think it's that the tech industry is so strategically important is because there are so other few like jobs that are lucrative and stable. And I mean, the stability of tech jobs is, is debatable. It's a controversial topic, but I think like if you look at fields like journalism, if you look at fields like, I don't know, just being in academia or like being a writer, working on something creative, that's hard. A lot of these industries are a lot of these fields are being defunded. It's really precarious a lot of the time to pursue something that's, not profitable for capital, shall we say. And so in a sense, like, I guess I would caution people who are considering quitting tech to do something else. That's like, it's going to be hard. Like, just maybe investigate the prospects and make sure that's something that you're willing to commit to. Cause like, if you try to get like a master's degree and then or a PhD and then get a job in academia, job prospects are really, really, really awful. And the media industry has just gotten so many, cuts, layoffs, all these private equity firms taking over, publications and just like eviscerating them. And I think that's really hard as well. And in a sense, like the way to, I guess, decide for yourself what you want to do is to, first of all, like recognize what your personal moral commitments are, but also what what your needs are. And do you need to have a stable salary with health insurance to be able to support yourself and your family? If so, I don't necessarily recommend going to grad school. I was lucky in that I had enough savings to be able to pay for my degree flat out rather than taking on debt. But I mean, it's, the degrees are expensive. It's really, really hard to do it. And I still don't really know what I'm going to be doing now. Like, I don't really see an obvious career path. I'll probably just end up, working for whatever companies I can find that seem like okay. But yeah, I think it's really hard right now. I think it is very difficult in the world we live in to be completely committed to your ethical principles, just because it's like, it's not a you problem. It is the world's problem. Like, this world just is awful, and there aren't that many great choices. So I think, the best any one of us can do is just find where we feel comfortable, where we like are able, like a place that allows us to get up every day and feel like we're not just miserable about things, 'cause, in a sense, that's the best you can ask for. And yeah, and I would say, like, if you feel like there's potential for organizing in your workplace, then yeah, give it a shot, right? Like, what's the worst that can happen? You'll probably learn more through doing that than you would through, I don't know, like in a technical sense, like coding wise. I think for me personally, I'm just finding that, like, I thought I knew everything because I knew how to code. I'm like, oh, there are entire dimensions of human experience that can't be reduced to coding. That's an important thing to learn. So yeah, just from that sense alone, I'd recommend, if you are able to organize, do it. And in terms of reading recommendations, I guess for something on tech worker organizing in particular, I would recommend Logic magazine. They put out an essay called "The Making of the Tech Worker Movement," which is really, really great, essay, like really pretty long essay actually, that features the voices of various tech workers who tried to organize and people who have like labor perspectives. And I think that's a really good way to situate yourself in the moment. And then more reading recommendation, just like labor history in general. I think there's a lot of it out there. Anything that has to do with people who are like trying to organize and demand something better, you will definitely find inspiration in that. So yeah, hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Awesome. Yeah. And, you're talking about, I feel like, studying, labor history and stuff recently. And, like you said, it can be a little demoralizing, thinking about how disastrous some parts of the world are. And I find like one of the things that keeps me kind of going beyond studying past labor history, because I think that is a huge sense of just real momentum you can just bring to your work in studying that and feeling like, oh my gosh, we're part of this longer arc of like human struggle. That's really something that I think can really motivate you. But I think also like learning about what's going on right now, right? So we have this awesome question from one of the folks in the live stream who just asks, what's one of your favorite recent moments of workers standing up to their bosses?
Ooh, recent.
There's a lot of them picked from, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if I have something I'd categorize as a favorite, but I've just been like, reading whatever articles I can find and listening to podcasts. I was reading about Amazon workers in France, specifically like warehouse workers. And that I thought was pretty inspiring because, I mean, this was just like in the last couple of months, because of the pandemic, they were, they still had to go to work. They still had to go to work next to each other in warehouses that they didn't think were safe. But at the same time, like, you know, they were told that if they didn't go to work, then it would be taken as like quitting, and then they wouldn't be eligible for unemployment or whatever. And it was really unclear and confusing, and people still went to work. But what they found was that even though Amazon said they were only doing essentials, they weren't just doing essentials. They were delivering all these things that they thought were just not necessarily essentials, but they had to do it, and they had no say in that. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you can find the essay on N+1 as like N+1 Amazon warehouse workers if you're interested. But I thought that was pretty inspiring, where you had all these workers who I think they ended up going on strike, and like they also worked with the union through legal channels to try to raise the issue. Yeah, and I thought that was great that you had these workers who were just like, yeah, you know, we don't want to do this anymore. This is not okay. At a very strange and like historically unprecedented moments. I think I found that really inspiring. I wish I had a better answer. I didn't prepare for that question.
No, I think that's great. You know, for me, I would point to all the Google organizing right now around police contracts and stuff. But that's an awesome one, and I love that you pointed to something beyond the borders of the United States too. I feel like people get very trapped within just like a very national framework in the labor movement, and I love that you're connecting out to other struggles.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth remembering that like so many countries have much more militant labor movements than the US does, and they have like a greater history of like success. And if you look at France, especially, I mean, France had a general strike recently, and it was amazing. Like that's something where, you know, I think all of us in the US should look to that and be like, why don't we have something like that? Like, how do we build towards that? I remember this one photo in particular of seeing these ballerinas who were giving a performance to the strikers because they were also on strike. And it's like, wow, if we get to the point where like all of these types of workers in all these industries are on strike, then that's just a qualitatively different environment for labor. And I think that's really inspiring, and it's worth remembering that, you know, there is a lot to aspire to, and it's you know, it's not just about like organizing at your workplace. It's about like building this greater network of organized labor where people in all of these different workforces are kind of connected to each other and able to work in concert with each other.
Yeah. So in terms of like, I mean, you just said it like creating a radically different environment. You know, the title of your book, I think can sometimes be a little polarizing, you know, Abolish Silicon Valley. So, you know, I think I know what that means to you having read the book, but I'd be curious to just hear you say like, what does abolishing Silicon Valley mean to you in the context of all of this?
Yeah, it's a brash title, and you know, it's like sometimes I regret it because I think it is an unnecessarily polarizing, and some people will see it and be like, "What? This is horrible." But you know, the book is actually much more nuanced than the title suggests. I always have to like explain that to people. You know, I decided the title like ages before I even wrote the book, and by the time I wrote it, I was like, "Oh, this does not match the title," but it's kind of too late. But yeah, I think what it means to me. So the reason I was thinking about the term abolition is because at that time, the time that I like, you know, came up with that kind of slogan, people were talking about abolishing ICE. And, you know, that, and the concept of abolition is something that has been theorized by prison abolition theorists and activists, people who talk about police abolition, but also, you know, it goes back to people who talk about abolition of private property, for example. And so it's like, it's a very broad concept. And I definitely find the prison abolition movement to be really inspiring, even though I don't know that much about it, but it's something I'm like trying to learn more about. But I think the way I think about abolition is that it's not just about destroying something. It's not just about, for example, like in the case of prisons, it's, you know, you're not just saying just close down all the prisons, like open all the doors tomorrow. It's more like, how would you restructure society so that this sort of thing isn't needed? So in the context of Silicon Valley, the question I'm trying to pose with the slogan "Abolish Silicon Valley" is, what would it mean for the world to not need Silicon Valley? Because maybe we've progressed past the point where Silicon Valley is useful, if there ever was such a point. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we do technology? Like, how do we innovate? How do we create fast scaling companies or whatever? And it's like, well, maybe we have a different way of doing it. Maybe instead of this venture capital model where you take some like Stanford dropout and then you give them $10 million to build whatever they want, maybe we have a more cooperative way of developing things and choosing what technology to develop. Maybe a lot of the tech that we have today just wouldn't be developed at all, because it's not actually something that most of us want. It's instead just something that arises because of the current economic system that we have. I'm thinking like all the advertising technology that we have. I mean, like, is that something that we would design if we had a more democratic and like, I don't know, just different system that had more social values as opposed to strictly economic ones? So yeah, to me, abolishing Silicon Valley is just a way of saying that like the system that we have now that gave rise to Silicon Valley as it exists today is not eternal. It's not natural. It's not something that just, is the natural endpoint for human society. This is not the best we can do, basically. Just like prisons, just like the police, just like, private property. And I think I'm trying to frame it as this like broader system, how it's not just Silicon Valley by itself. It's not like the stuff came out of a vacuum. The way the tech industry evolved has to do with this broader political economic terrain that means that, having billion or trillion dollar companies becomes inevitable after a certain point, just because this is what is incentivized and permitted by the system. And I'm trying to like pose the question, what if we didn't have that? What if we had a world without billionaires? What if we had a world with a much more democratic distribution of wealth? What if we had a world where people felt more connected to the product of their labor and had more of a say in the things that they were working on? How would that look like? I don't know exactly. It's more just like, I think it would not look like what we have today. And that to challenge the idea that what we have today is the best of all worlds, because I really don't think it is. I think, we've naturalized these inequalities, these hierarchies, these norms, and nothing about them is natural. It feels natural because the powerful would like you to think that it's natural, and they will and do whatever they can to make you believe that's natural. But we have to hold on to the possibility that there's something else, and that especially a time like now, where you're looking around, where this country, the US, is doing so horribly in the middle of this pandemic. Unemployment is just through the roof. So many people just can't pay their rent. I think it becomes so clear now more than ever that we have to do something different, because this is just not working. The system is not working. It was never really working for most people, but now it's so clear that it's just not working, and that, Silicon Valley didn't cause this. It's not the originator of the problem, but at the same time, it is like a microcosm of some of the worst excesses of capitalism. And I would like us all to imagine how to do better than that. Can we innovate in a sense on the Silicon Valley model and create something new that's infused with a different set of values that are more about solidarity and connection to each other, as opposed to this kind of like competitive, I don't know, rat race of just like trying to be with the one billionaire among everyone who's not a billionaire. It's just, it feels so profoundly immoral to me to look at the way Silicon Valley is run. And yeah, I would love to abolish it. I would love to replace it with something better.
Okay, great. We're going to have to sadly wrap up here for the night. Thank you to everyone for tuning into the live stream. And thank you to Wendy for coming to speak with us. Do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share with viewers, or obviously like where can people find your work online, or what have you been up to?
Yeah, so thank you both for inviting me to speak. This has been lovely, and I really admire all the work that you're doing. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm Dellsystem, DELLSYSTEM. It's don't ask. Or you can email me, if you're thinking about organizing or just like kind of interested in the ideas in the book. I'd be happy to chat. So yeah, thanks, and take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Thanks so much. Again, this is Code Talk, a monthly series hosted by CODE-CWA, where workers and organizers in the tech industry study and explore the historical, economic, and political context in which we struggle. The campaign to organize digital employees is an initiative by the Communication Workers of America to support workers' organizing efforts in the technology, game, and digital media industries. Learn more about CODE-CWA and contact your organizer at code-cwa.org. Solidarity forever, y'all.